Hello everyone, I'm Manjima Sarkar and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS review in association with Oxford University Press. Under this theme, TMYS Review December 2022 will explore the role of artistic endeavors of society in shaping cultural identity and ideology. I would also like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Today's topic of discussion is webcomics and digital storytelling. We are honored to have with us Professor Laurence and Professor Lucas Landherr as our esteemed speakers for the panel. Thank you so much for joining us, professors. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Laurence is Professor of French and Text or Image Studies and Director of the Sterling Maxwell Centre for the Study of Text or Image Cultures at the University of Glasgow. His research focuses on historical aspects of text or image forms, and in particular, bande dessinée. He is the president of the International Bande Dessinée Society, as well as serving on the consultative committees of a number of journals. He is joint editor of European Comic Art. Laurence, also known as Billy, has authored in full or jointly 12 books and approximately 60 chapters or articles. He co-curated Comic Invention, Hunterian Glasgow, and Frank Quitely, The Art of Comics, Kelvin Grove, Glasgow, and is co-author of their accompanying books. Now let me introduce my next speaker. Dr. Luke Landherr is Chemical Engineering Professor at Northeastern University, conducting research on visual learning tools, including comics and videos. They have been producing educational comics for the journal Chemical Engineering Education for over 5 years and helped create the YouTube series Crash Course Engineering. Under the pseudonym Dante Shepherd, they previously created the daily webcomic, surviving the world for more than 10 years and over 3,500 comics. Now, without further delay, we shall start with today's session. Professor Grove, I request you to please present your views on today's topic. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Manjima. And first of all, a big thank you to you and the organising team. It's been impeccably organised, and it's a project which really looks to the future, but encrusts itself entirely with current culture. So it's a really exciting endeavour to be taking on. I'll tell you a little bit about myself first of all, and you'll see the relevance of this. I was born and grew up in London and in southern England, but my mum was French. So most of my family was in the north of France. I grew up speaking French and English, and I loved comics. Asterix was what I grew up with. I then was lucky enough to travel a bit, being educated in England, then in North America, in Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Middlebury in Vermont, before coming to Glasgow, which is now home and which I adore. The reason for me telling you all this is because I think part of what scholarship involves increasingly is a personal journey, and you can't really understand scholarship until you understand the people and the places behind it. I came to comics as through text image forms such as emblem books in the 16th and 17th century, before working on more recent comics, the 19th century onwards and into the 20th century, specializing in French comics bande dessinée. My current project is called The Collapse of the Canon, and you will see what all this has to do with webcomics, in which I'm looking at the question of why is it when I was at university as an undergraduate, and many of us around here were reading a canon based on great works. So we would read Shakespeare, Robert Burns, we would read Longfellow. In my case, it was a French canon, so it was Molière, Racine, Corneille. But nowadays in universities, that seems to be less and less the case. Why has this happened and why has this collapsed? The date I'm giving to this change is 1984. And it was in 1984, not by reference to George Orwell, but in 1984, the first Macintosh came along as we know it. And that seems to me as to be a revolution in learning and in reception of learning. Why? Because people all of a sudden became actors rather than just receivers. And if we look at courses in universities from that time onwards, we're switching from the list of great white male authors to interactive possibilities. We're switching to different forms. We're switching to cinema, to gaming studies, and comics, which is where I came in. And as comics go forward, we have the comics from the 19th century, but we're increasingly seeing online contributions. Now, why did this collapse happen? What are the markers of this collapse of the canon? Well, I would say, first of all, it's involved with the death of the author. Death of the author, not necessarily in the sense of Roland Barthes or the way that Derrida refers to it, but in the idea of having an author who isn't necessarily named. And that's what's happening online. Not all the time with webcomics, but some webcomics, and certainly memes, which we can say are related, are anonymous. So much more of today's culture, like the great cathedrals to which Roland Barthes refers, is without an author named. The second sign of the collapse of the canon, I would say, is the loss of gatekeepers. It used to be that who decided these great lists? Well, it was the university professors in their gowns who were male and white, who drew up lists of books which were to be read. Well, that's not happening anymore. The new gatekeepers are the people online, such as this very forum. The gatekeepers are the journalists and the webmasters. Gatekeeping, i.e. choosing who reads what and why, is very much more open to those who put themselves forward. The third element to the collapse of the canon, I would say, is hybridity. Technology has changed in so that whereas the canon used to be texts, single written prose on paper often, now it's not just prose, it's images, it's not on paper, it's beyond paper. It can be on cellulite as it used to be, but now it's increasingly digital. And finally, linked to this hybridity is technology. I would say it's technology that collapses the canon. It happened in the 16th century and the 15th century with the inventing of printing, where we went from the stained glass windows of the Middle Ages to these books, which you could have hundreds of copies at the same time. And in the 20th and the 21st centuries, technology has once again changed how we approach culture. Technology through cinema, through television, and now through the internet. How's this linked to webcomics? Because it seems to me that webcomics epitomize all of these elements. They often are, not necessarily, but often are authorless. They certainly involve new web gatekeepers. They are as hybrid as you could possibly get. Some are moving, some are not moving, some are online only, some disappear, some remain, some then go into print versions. And of course, webcomics rely on technology. So it seems to me that webcomics are the essence of this new culture, the collapse of the canon. Now, the final point I wanted to make is that so much of it is linked, and it seems to me, with what I'm calling personal journey criticism. It used to be in the 19th century with people like Hippolyte Taine, but we weren't really allowed to say, I've chosen this book because I like it. It wasn't a question of personal choice. It was some sort of empirical criteria that made an author great. Though, of course, we know that there's always personal choice. And what I'm suggesting is that nowadays it's a lot more acceptable to say, I choose this book because that's what I grew up with. I choose this method of expressing myself because these are the influences of me as a kid. And these influences can be cultural, they can be format based, they can be national as well. It's lovely to see in this forum people from different continents in different time zones. Webcomics involve narrative, storytelling. Storytelling is at the base of our personal journeys. And what I'm suggesting is that academic analysis is not so much academic analysis, purely scientific, theoretical, empirical, but more and more there's the overlap between academic analysis and creative writing. telling our own stories. And it's by telling our own stories that we understand the world better. I think you can see from this summary that the aspects of this collapse of canon and the personal journey are exactly the aspects that fit with webcomics, digital studies, and tell me your story. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for summarizing so beautifully and sharing your brilliant insights. Now, I request Dr. Landherr to please present your views on today's topic. Over to you, sir.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me, and it is exciting to be a part of a forum like this and to hear all of Laurence's thoughts and everything else. I think my views on comics kind of extend from a bunch of different directions. I certainly read tons and tons of comic books as a kid, and I always found it interesting when some of the comics would use what are pretty much straight educational techniques in there. Some were really blatant, just straight up giving you an information dump that could almost come out of a textbook to explain how a black hole works. And then you've got a whole series of comics that use metaphors to try to explain, a underrepresented group. Like that's basically the whole point of the X-Men, right? It's to kind of explain that whole background, and the educational side of things is there. And if you go back into the educational aspect of comics, basically after they got introduced in the 1930s in the United States, you pretty much had by the 1940s just tons and tons of children reading comic books. I think it's like 96% of kids aged 8 through 14 and like 76% of kids in high school were all reading comic books at the time. And what are you going to do educationally? You're basically going to start researching this. You're going to start saying, is there ways, if everyone is using these kind of approaches, are there ways that we can, check to see if this is beneficial? And there are studies that started getting conducted into the vocabulary. It starts getting into reading ability. You get so many studies actually being done. You get whole issues of journals that are being dedicated to just looking at comics and education. Can they be used for educational purposes? And pretty much the outcome of all this is, this extends to pretty much any field. You can pretty much cover any topic using these things. There's a cultural backlash, on the other hand, that happens because they're saying, well, this is entirely different and it's hurting kids' eyes and it's hurting their ability to read. And it all kind of culminates with Dr. Frederick Wertham producing this book called Seduction of the Innocent, claiming all these awful things that comics are effectively doing. And because of his book and because of some testifying he did, some testifying he did, he effectively killed off most research into comics in educational purposes for decades and decades. And it really is only until you start getting some comics like Mouse being celebrated, some receiving higher awards, that it kind of in the last 2 decades you finally start seeing comics kind of come into educational purposes and try and be used to try to for whatever purpose it might be, whether it's in engineering, whether it's in science, whether it's art, whatever topic they are trying to potentially teach with. And I think it's kind of along that same line that while they're very interesting comics and fun comics to read that are being produced throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, right? It's really only still was a really limited aspect of who could basically publish the comics, who could basically be producing these, whether there was in a newspaper or whether it was in kind of a comic book format. And the rise of the internet basically allowed for means of people who were interested in creating comics, whatever format they wanted to use, whatever kind of topics they wanted to talk about, they could just be able to release these, and they could release it on whatever schedule they wanted to. So you get really kind of wide ranges of approaches that just wouldn't necessarily wouldn't have been kind of allowed in. So you can have things that are just entirely hand-drawn, or things that are clip art based, or things that are photography based, like I used for 10 years. Whatever medium possibly applies there. And it's not limited to who, to who is allowed to be kind of delivering these comics, right? For a long time, it was mainly white cis men were basically the ones who were doing the writing, doing the drawing, and there were some exceptions for sure, right? But for the majority of them was kind of being covered by these individuals. Once it goes online, you get many other authors being able to make these things, many other writers and artists. Whatever it is, there's far more women, there's far more persons of color, there's far more queer individuals. They're all kind of able to kind of produce what they want to do. And that's where I think that there are a lot of opportunities that, further research would allow for. Are you potentially looking at representation in these comics and what they're able to apply for, in terms of who they're potentially able to reach. And so kind of how this all connects to webcomics is webcomics has really been, an answer to both, comics in comic book format, comics in newspapers. It is allowed for serial storytelling and incredibly long arcs that have been told. And people have been doing this now for, 10, 20 years, telling these stories, whatever, their characters. There's comics that start and tell shorter stories and then come and go. You get the ones that are just simply the joke of the day. And there's not really potentially any more depth than that. But there are tons of opportunities for pretty much anyone to be able to make comics. I had done the math about 10 years ago, I think. And I think there were about 300 newspaper comics that were being regularly published in the United States. And there were something like 30,000 webcomics, at least, that were online at the time. I'm pretty sure that's an underestimation of how many webcomics there were. And it was the opportunity for everyone to potentially have a voice, potentially be able to share, what it is that they are passionate about, whatever their thoughts were. For me, when I was making webcomics, it was some of it was certainly joke of the day. Some of it was trying to create better insight, or make it seem like I had better insight than I potentially did. But I was able to use a photography medium, and there was no really limitation on that. There's no limitation on size or shape. If I wanted to have something that was just one panel versus something that was 14 panels or more, there was no limitation on that. And that's really what a lot of webcomics allows for. There's no restrictions on the art. There's no restrictions on the humor. And people could be creating them in obscurity, and people could be able to kind of find something that kind of extends further on, depending on exactly they are interested in doing, depends on, how passionate they are. Why they are making these. But there are so many great comics that are so fun to read, so many that are educational. People able to kind of put whatever they are looking for in there. The web format allows for a lot of distribution of more standard comics. Some of the comics that I create with my students or create for educational purposes on the undergraduate level or K through 12, I'm able just to share these online, and other educators are able to find them and bring them into the classes. Some of the ones that I've made, they've just kind of been pretty readily adapted and kind of taken into other uses. And I've, it is not just in classrooms, it has been used in court cases and everything else like this, because people are able to find these online, and they're able to find a different way of being able to kind of share and connect and discuss things on not just a verbal level, but a visual level, and through the medium of comics, which again, we've known for so many decades can reach and entertain and educate. But that's a lot of what I think about with webcomics. There's a lot of different things that are kind of connected there. But having a conversation like this, I think is fantastic.
Thank you so much, sir. All right. I'm so sorry. I think there is a technical glitch, but thank you so much for sharing your insights, and especially like talking about the liberating aspect of webcomics. And it was an amazing session indeed. We shall now begin our question answer session. So I would like to ask my first question to Professor Laurence Grove. Sir, one of your research interests is providing a historic approach to comics. Could you please tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, of course. Can you hear me and see me, or at least one of the two?
I can hear you. I can only see me, which is uncomfortable. But there we go.
I can talk, and you can do the actions, Luke, and we can make a webcomic out of this. Originally, my research came from the early modern period in that I worked on emblem books, which are picture books of the 16th and 17th century. And many of these would tell stories. And you could say to some extent that people have always told stories. We can go back to Trajan's column in Roman times. We can go back even further. We can go back to cave art and say to a certain extent that's using pictures to tell a story, although with cave art it's a bit difficult to know what the story is. Myths and legends throughout the centuries, and I think a lot of the Indian myths and legends are extremely interactive and visual. So the question is, when does it go from being visual storytelling to being a comic? I would define a comic as something then that you can take home, you can fold up, and you can even throw away, although most comics nerds will never throw away their comics. And in order for that to happen, because you can't really take Trajan's column home and read it in your living room, in order for that to happen, there needed to be the technology of mass reproduction, and that came with lithography, which was discovered and explored around 1800 onto somewhere between 1796 and the years that followed. So I would say that the first comic, and here's a facsimile of it, was in fact the Glasgow Looking Glass. Now, previously, people said that the first comics were some of the books by Adolf Topfer, the Swiss school teacher who drew stories in images to amuse his pupils. I would say that the difference with this one is that it's a publication intended for sale. And so this is what it looked like, first issue. So this is something which will mix pictures with words to tell stories. And in this case, you can buy it, you can take it home, you can fold it up, you can throw it away. So it's technology which has allowed this to happen. The modern comic comes as a result of technology. As the printing technology evolved, so comics became more mainstream in that printing would allow not just hundreds or thousands of copies, but let's say offset printing would then allow for tens of thousands of copies with increasingly high quality outputs. And then the next revolution came with digital technology. Digital technology initially in terms of printing, and then digital technology in terms of the web, which is a different format output for the primary sources. As one of my PhD students, Laura Blackman, has pointed out, it seems that the history of the internet is closely linked to the history of webcomics. It doesn't seem to be, I haven't been able to find that much on it, but it's a really interesting topic which Laura is exploring into, well, what did webcomics look like when the first interchanges online? I don't know if you remember some of these were those initial ones, the Netscape and the like. I don't know if you ever remember looking at these things. And the webcomics that went with it were similarly pixelated. Increasingly, as online technology becomes more and more sophisticated, so do the comics that go along with it. One example is Marietta Ren's Philena, which is, and if you Google that, it's Phallaina. It's a story which is told in a scrolling panel. So not only do you have text, you have the image, you have the music, and then it moves along. So it's somewhere between comics and cinema. It seems that evolution is linked to technology, but technology doesn't overtake storytelling, and you can have an absolutely wonderful gadget. You can have all sorts of digital playthings, but if you haven't got the base story there, it's not going to be quite as good. So what you need, I think, is something that plays around with the modern aspects of the world around us and the technology, but still tells a story which could, to some extent, go back thousands of years.
Thank you so much, sir, for helping us visualize the journey of comics with the aid of technology, of course. On that note, I would like to ask you, how do you think webcomics can transform the familiar patterns of visual storytelling in the next 10 years?
To some extent, webcomics gives artists an opportunity that they didn't have before. So Penelope Bagieux is now a mainstream artist in France, and she started off with her blog, with Instagram accounts, putting up pictures, basically to tell of her work as a visual designer. These stories about great women who have struggled against the odds then became a weekly blog. More and more people became interested. That then transferred to online Le Monde, so it became very mainstream, and then it became a book publication. And part of what I'm trying to do at the moment is to get that onto the highest syllabus in all schools in Scotland. So what we have is an interaction, I think, between online technology and traditional print sources. I don't think, just as the song goes, that video didn't kill the radio star, I don't think that the internet is going to kill the library reader. I think that the two are going to interact, and that they will play upon each other, because some of the aspects of books will always be needed. I like holding a book, going through the pages, and sometimes scribbling on them. On the other hand, I carry a phone around in my pocket, so it's quite nice when I'm on the subway in Glasgow to be able to look up a comic. So the two are used for different purposes in different places, which is very much the history of comics, having different formats to fit different uses. There would be, back in the 16th or 17th century, great big luxury printed productions. They were for at home, for in the equivalent of a coffee table. There'd also be smaller books which you carry around in your pocket. So I think the more opportunities we have, they don't cancel each other out. They just take us further on a journey. It would be great to have a webcomics form on the history of webcomics. Luke, I don't know if you're the one to create that.
Thank you so much, sir, for exploring the different formats of storytelling through comics. It was a pleasure indeed to learn a lot from you. And now my next question is to Dr. Landherr. Sir, what or who has inspired you to teach complex science and engineering concepts through comics?
So part of it is that when I first started teaching here at Northeastern, my very first semester, I taught a course called Thermodynamics 2. And in thermodynamics for chemical engineers involves a lot of chemical equilibrium. It involves just a ton of math. It's almost nothing but theory and math. And it's very hard to create anything that's visual component of it. And there is one concept called fugacity, which is pretty well understood as the concept that every chemical engineer learns. But they don't remember what it is after they graduate. And I can tell you for sure that I didn't know exactly what it meant until I started having to teach it, right? And so I was, asking myself, pounding my brain, is there anything that I could do to try to make this easier for students to learn so they actually remember what kind of goes on with it? And the funny thing is that even in STEM, where a lot of students, you would think that they would be learning a lot of theory. They think they would kind of have a tendency for kind of more verbal or math side of things. They still really want visual learning tools, right? There's still a real preference for kind of visual learning tools. Over and over again, when I run surveys with students, that's what they say that they want. And so then the question is, how do you create these? What is it that you possibly want to do? I mean, you can make videos, right? But there are only so many students that are going to be willing to watch a video of a professor at a board, right? Just kind of teaching exactly what they saw earlier that day. I record my lectures for students, and I don't understand those who want to go rewatch the lectures later on, right? It doesn't necessarily make sense to me. Whereas, if you find some other potential approach that, still creates that visual aspect to it, that's where the benefit was. So with my interest in comics and background there, I asked myself, could something like this potentially be used even at the undergraduate level, where it is kind of a really highly technical term? And the secret to this a little bit is that you can basically, that there are questions that are always going to be asked by the people that are learning this. What does this matter? Why is this used? Or, maybe more specific, like, what is the relationship between these two different terms? you can basically capture all of that visually just by effectively drawing, a dialogue between two different people, right? And if you're not necessarily, even if, something is kind of highly technical, it could be people interacting with the variables from an equation, right? Or showing how that works, right? Or, them just kind of being able to move around that space and where there is some potential visual application, you're able to kind of bring that in. So there is that connection, right? And so that's where comics really kind of allows for a lot of opportunity, is that you can potentially create a kind of visual learning tool that you could either have digital and certainly share that way. And if students are basically keeping digital notes, that's great. They can just kind of grab that and kind of, copy and paste that right into their notes. If they're taking print notes, you can print it out. And they can be, when they're reviewing and studying for exams or whatever, just, reviewing for whatever purpose it is, they've got that basically they've got that lecture captured there. And so you've got a way that they can basically have a way to be able to interact there. If they have a student character in there, they're going to identify with that student character, whoever it is that are asking questions. So you can draw that deeper connection to whatever the learning tools are. And so from there, I've been able to do a lot with that, and especially when they are being digitally shared. In some of my classes, I have asked students to say, all right, well, here's an assignment. You're actually going to make a comic yourself. You're actually going to make a learning tool, and then we're going to share that with future iterations of the class. Once I started doing that and basically just kind of share, for every week, as students are going through in future iterations, say, all right, here's a couple different comics that students have made, and they're all available here on, these digital sources. And that way, you can also get additional kind of learning if you want to from them. And then the following week is like, okay, here's a bunch more that relate to what we were talking with. Once I started doing that, I saw exam grades go way up because, students had another tool they could potentially take from, right? And I think that's the benefit of comics, like the benefit of videos and everything else, right? Is that, when we are learning, we tend to learn from a bunch of different types of tools, right? And each of us individually learn from different aspects. If you're teaching, you need a really large toolbox, right? And comics offer a really unique opportunity within that overall toolbox to try to help the overall educational process.
Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing a slice of your personal journey as a teacher. And I would like to ask you another question.
Sure.
Do you think it is pertinent to have a protagonist or just one main character in a science webcomic series?
I think that there's a bunch of different ways to think about that, right? I think that one of the great aspects about comics is that you're not limited based on who is depicted there, right? You could, anthropomorphize the characters, with just talking animals if that's what you wanted to do, right? Or you could have, talking molecules or any, talking equations or variables, right? But I think that one of the aspects there, that one of the real opportunities is the fact that you can have a greater representation in your, in the comics that you're using for educational purposes than maybe the other tools normally provide, right? We start, from depending on what the resources are, a lot of times, the main people that are being cited who created these equations, who discovered these different aspects, right? Depending on how long ago it was discovered, right? A lot of those, again, tend to be white cis males. Whereas if you were using comics as your learning tool, right, there's nothing that's requiring you to present the same stereotypical crazy white-haired scientist as the main character, right? You can, create a really wide range so students can see themselves. And I think this is, I've seen this as when students are creating the comics themselves as part of the assignments in my classes. The characters they make are, look like them, right? And the people that they're talking to look like them, right? They are not basically just kind of creating standard, characters. They are creating, people that they personally identify with. So, do you need an antagonist? I don't, or a protagonist. You can basically have one character that's possibly just, delivering the lecture if that's what need be. I think there's real opportunity to having more than one, so that way you can have that dialogue, so you can represent those questions that get asked so often, right? And I think that it's beneficial to have more than one, so you get a wider range of the people who are reading them to be able to see themselves in the work, right? And I think that there's tons of different ways you can potentially do this, right? I think that if you are doing this in kind of a digital format, there potentially could be ways that we could really think about the educational aspects here. What if effectively the reader effectively to be able to access these comics, right? This is, provide a little bit of background about who they are, what they identify as. You could potentially have the comics themselves kind of adjust to basically try to match up with who it is that is reading, right? And maybe they'll be able to learn more, maybe they'll, from the representation that in terms of seeing themselves in the work, right? I mean, there's tons of different things that we could kind of study in kind of making these comics. I think that one of the one drawback to, honestly, and part of a lot of comics research is that it's too much fun making these, and it is too much fun kind of making these different tools, and that's where the passion lies. And then no one says, "Oh, I probably should analyze as well, what the benefits of these are or how to use these." And so I think that there's just the amount of work that's being done that is educational or has incredible benefits compared to people actually looking at, are these actually helpful? What is the best way of actually using these? I think there's a real disparity between those. But it also means that there's a real opportunity to try to figure out ways that we can kind of keep on making these better, right? And keep on making them more beneficial. So yeah, have characters, have more than one, have as many characters as you think that it makes sense for what you're trying to present, right? And absolutely, someone will benefit from that, in terms of how you're presenting that.
Thank you so much, Professor Landherr. And we understood that how it's important to relate to the characters more. And when you were talking about that white-haired crazy scientist, it definitely reminded me of Rick and Morty. So yeah.
There's that, and it's also, I think it's also, to me, it's like Back to the Future, like that okay, that's what a scientist looks like, right? That's one of the main kind of examples. And so you just, it's like, all right, well, that's got to set the stereotype, that's at the definition, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. With this, we now come to the end of today's fun session. Of course, I would once again like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. I extend a heartfelt thanks to Professor Laurence Crow and Professor Lucas Landherr for this wonderful and remarkable session. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Manjima.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.